Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar hosted by Climate Strategies on exploring just resilience, equity-centered adaptation, frameworks and perspectives in Kenya and Bangladesh, during which we will explore the emerging policy agenda of just resilience. My name is Nicole Kempis. I'm Development and Program Manager at Climate Strategy. And for those who are not quite familiar with us yet, we are an international not-for-profit research network working on bridging the gap between climate research and policy alongside our members, who are leading climate researchers from around the world. Climate Strategies has worked extensively on just transitions for the past decade across a variety of sectors and geographies. That work has led us to explore adaptation within just transitions. And although just transitions are typically focused on mitigation, our past few years of research have consistently demonstrated strong linkages to adaptation, which are particularly relevant in the Global South contexts. So building on these intersections, we convened a project on just resilience last year. This event, which explores just resilience from different perspectives, falls under the umbrella of our South to South Just Transitions program. Over the last 5 years, this program has supported researchers from 9 countries in the Global South to build capacity on just transition analysis. This project is currently undertaking research focused on justice and adaptation, with the aim of understanding what just resilience means in different contexts, identifying national priorities, and providing recommendations. The need for adaptation is increasing rapidly, and as we build our collective understanding of justice and equity implications of adaptation policy, we need frameworks to ensure that the impacts and benefits of policies are equally shared and do not inadvertently burden those who are most vulnerable. Such frameworks need to consider procedural and distributional justice, related to the impacts of adaptation policy and the unequal distribution of climate impacts more broadly. Today, we are exploring these questions through the lens of just resilience. And as this concept gains momentum, it's essential that it reflects the needs of the global majority, ensuring that frameworks and practices are responsive to realities faced by communities who are most affected. We are joined today by experts from around the world on this question to begin the conversation, allowing us to consider how to incorporate justice and equity into climate adaptation. So to help us navigate today's topics, we have a remarkable group of partners who we've been working with during this phase of South to South. So we will begin today with a presentation to explore the concept of just resilience and current trends from Frida Lager, Research Associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute within the Climate, Energy and Society Unit. Then we will hear from partners from Kenya and Bangladesh, including Professor Richard Mulwa, Center Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Environment for Development Institute at the University of Nairobi, and also member of Climate Strategies, leading various economic and environmental analysis. And we will also be joined by Professor Shamsad Murtuza, Professor and Special Advisor at the University of Liberal Arts in Bangladesh. So our speakers will explore the concept of just resilience from the national context and provide insights into key priorities, needs, and opportunities. Without further ado, I'll give our floor to the first speaker. Welcome, Frida.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Yes, that's great. So thank you everyone for joining this session. So I've been asked to go through some of the findings and key messages from a scoping study that we did. Me and my colleagues, Michael and Michelson at the Stockholm Environment Institute, together with Climate Strategies, starting in the beginning of this year. So next slide, please. I'll go through with you just the core aspects of just resilience or justice and adaptation, as it is really an emerging agenda. We'll talk about recent developments in this concept, what it is about, so the conceptual framing of it, how structural vulnerability and social justice from local scale to global interacts in these settings. And lastly, talk a little bit about latest policy developments of relevance for practitioners and research communities that are trying to sort of grapple with and adopt justice and the adaptation action. Next slide, please. So this picture on this slide is just the front page of the report that we just published. Yeah, it's available on Climate Strategies website. And I'll walk you through some of what we think are key findings from this. And so the concept of just resilience, justice, equity, and fairness really in climate adaptation has become a subject of increased attention in recent years, both in the context of growing recognition that the impacts of climate change and future climate risk will affect people differently according to where they live, their income, ethnicity, age, gender, abilities, and disabilities. Social groups, communities, and countries who are most vulnerable and have the least capacity to adapt to climate change will be disproportionately affected by climate impacts, as well as having contributed the least to causing the crisis in the first place. There's also growing evidence that adaptation interventions that set out to reduce the negative impacts of climate change often have unintended or undesirable outcomes. We call this maladaptation. And what it does is that it shifts, reinforces, or even create new vulnerabilities for already marginalized people, communities, and places. Really, in short, adaptation action itself can create winners and losers. And even though we know quite a bit about how these things can play out, we're only sort of beginning to develop a collective understanding of the justice and equity implications for climate adaptation policy. Generally, climate impacts are assessed and projected at global, continental, or national scales, and often don't really offer data or insights into how these impacts are felt locally, what the drivers of vulnerability are from the local to the global, or the consequences for adaptation needs and outcomes for different countries, communities, and social groups. And you can switch slides, I think. Yeah, I also wanted to say just that in this agenda is sort of very much emerging from a Western policy space. And so we've been trying to focus in this report and also in this presentation and discussion today on sort of the implications for and really priorities for countries and communities in the global south. This slide just shows you the three sort of core aspects of just resilience. That is sort of the consensus approach right now in the latest literature, such as the latest IPCC AR6 report, where at least three core aspects of justice is or should be considered. So the first one is distributive justice, which I think is the one that most people are familiar with. It relates to the unequal distribution of burdens and benefits arising from climate impacts, but also the allocation of resources and burdens from adaptation action. So it really asks the question of who benefits and who is burdened. The second aspect is procedural justice, refers to the extent to which those affected by climate risk and adaptation action are meaningfully included in shaping climate adaptation action itself. It's ensured by embedding considerations of justice, fairness, and inclusivity into institutional processes and procedures, and those arenas for which decisions on adaptations are made. It really asks the questions of who is involved and how. And the third one, recognition justice, really underpins both the distributive and procedural justice. It focuses on acknowledging and respecting the identities, experience, and rights of individuals and groups, particularly those who are marginalized or oppressed, and whose livelihoods or way of life or history are often particularly at risk of climate impacts. It focuses on the basis, respect, fair consideration, and a robust engagement of diverse needs and cultures. It asks the question, what is at risk, what is valued, and from whose perspective, and according to whom. And these core perspectives of justice is really there to complement each other. Sometimes they are critiqued, or the whole approach is being critiqued for being too technical and carrying a risk of introducing new administrative burdens. And it's good to consider to what extent each of these sort of principles needs to be addressed. But it's a good starting point to sort of filter out or what are the core justice aspects of a certain adaptation action or climate risk. We won't go into it deeply today, but that there are other types of justice that it can be considered and can become more relevant in the future. and are being advocated for as we speak. Those are restorative justice, for example, intersectional justice aspects, or intergenerational justice, just as examples. You can change slides. I think I mentioned it before, but just another core aspect that really it tends to get lost sometimes, but is really crucial when you look at adaptation, justice and adaptation, is that these unequal outcomes can sort of both relate to the fact that people, places, and communities are burdened unequally by the climate risks themselves, but also that the actions of adaptation can also in themselves have unequal outcomes. You can change slides. So the impacts of climate change, they interact with existing socioeconomic inequities and exacerbate vulnerabilities that are associated with those. Poorer countries and communities with the fewest resources are likely to suffer the most from climate change with respect to the effects on lives and livelihoods, investments, and economic development. Just as an example, that a recent assessment showed that 74 of the world's poorest countries have been hit by nearly 8 times as many natural disasters over the last decade, compared to only in the 1980s, and with a 3-fold increase in economic damage for those already in a poor condition. At the same time, low-income countries have suffered the brunt of the economic costs from climate-related disasters, according to UNDRR. Within countries, households with lower incomes are likely to be more vulnerable to climate impacts and risk, with poorer households even severely affected when the effects of the wider population is limited. We know that the impacts of climate change interact with pre-existing structural inequities, such as those based on wealth, unequal opportunities, power dynamics, political capacity, age, health, education, gender, and ethnicity. And as such, structural vulnerability and inequities really sits at the core of the Just Resilience agenda. You can skip ahead again. I think I'm running out of time. I just wanted to say something about the international scale. Disturbances as well as adaptation, action, and responses to risk in one country can really also affect places and people thousands of kilometers away. Because we are in the global economy interdependent through trade, financial transactions and investments, migrations, and shared ecosystems. When the drivers of vulnerability are international in scale, an agency or power to influence or act lies outside the local context, failure to recognize and address connected drivers and risks can also lead to maladaptation. National and international adaptation interventions and also financing mechanisms that are embedded in social economic structures also come with existing issues of inequities. For example, the development agenda is being critiqued for its unequal, dysfunctional, and post-colonial structure and legacy. And as a lot of sort of the adaptation action or finance on the international arena is being tied to existing work, including those in the development agenda, this can kind of sort of repeat or exaggerate already existing inequalities. And I'll go to my next slide, which is the last one. The importance of justice for adaptation and resilience has really been elevated in just the past 5 years or so. And really we're seeing an emerging body of evidence suggesting that internationally funded adaptation interventions are not only failing to protect those most vulnerable and those with the least adaptive capacity, but in some cases, it even makes it worse. At the same time, the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report highlighted the importance of embedding different principles of justice, as we talked about, and to do this both between countries and within. There's been recent policy developments in the field, spirited especially by, again, richer countries, but with a diverse focus, reflecting kind of the country context. So we see in Europe a lot of efforts being done towards just resilience, which is a part, which is hi Nicole, give me just half more minutes. just resilience, which is a core principle of the EU adaptation strategy. In Canada and also Australia, we see strong indigenous principles being enacted into the policies there. And also South Africa latest efforts incorporates local voices and perspectives in climate resilience planning. And I'll just stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Frida, for that really informative presentation. And I think it's really helpful, those two aspects that you outlined for just resilience, both the efforts to reduce the impacts of potential maladaptation on vulnerable groups, as well as address the overarching inequalities in who experiences adaptation around the world. So I think that's a great segue into our presentation from Professor Richard Mulwa. So we'll go ahead and give you the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much, Nicole. So I'm going to present on just resilience in Kenya, frameworks and perspectives for equitable adaptation. The way I'm structuring this presentation, it's in 4 parts. So I'm going to discuss the local context, the vulnerable sectors and groups or people, then the barriers for just resilience, and also the opportunities that do exist. So let's go to the next slide. So there are 3 questions that we're asking ourselves here. The first question is, what is just resilience? Of course, we have the component of ensuring there's fairness and equity and inclusion in adaptation processes. And the focus here is largely on the global south, which has been disproportionately affected by climate change, despite their minimal emissions. And the why question is, we want to integrate justice and equity in the adaptation projects. There is a danger that we are going to have maladaptation if we are not very careful and miss on the leaving no one behind. The next slide, please. So there are 4 central questions that are going to lead the discussion here. And the first question is, how has Kenya or the Kenyan local context influenced developing and implementing just resilience frameworks? And what are the key sectors or the key priorities and the vulnerable populations? What challenges does Kenya face in integrating justice and equity? And how have communities in Kenya been impacted by adaptation actions? Next slide. So in the local context, there are lived realities of people in Kenya. So there are the socioeconomic realities. People are grappling with poverty and inequality, and also economic dependency on climate-sensitive sectors, especially agriculture. Then there's a cultural and traditional component, which has the ethnic diversity and traditional leaders. And I think Frida mentioned a component of this in her presentation when she was talking about recognition justice. Then we have environmental pressures, weather and urbanization, especially weather. There has been droughts and floods and changing rainfall patterns, which are impacting on people's livelihoods. And of course, rapid urbanization, which is constraining infrastructure and increasing vulnerability of informal settlements. Let's go to the next slide. So from a legal and policy context, when we look at the Kenyan Constitution, it's very clear on human rights. It guarantees the rights to life, health, and prosperity. There is also the component of environmental protection, or it recognizes the right to a clean, healthy environment that aligns with the resilience efforts. Then we have policies and acts in the land tenure that aims at securing land and also land use planning. Let's go to the next slide. Still on the legal and policy context, we have laws and policies on emergency response, disaster risk reduction, conservation, and pollution control. So in a nutshell, we can say that the country has a robust legal framework for climate change challenges, and a framework that vividly incorporates just resilience must be developed and mainstreamed into the main development documents. Currently, this may not be the case. if you go through our documents, you're not going to see explicit mention of just resilience in the document or in the adaptation document, although it might be practiced, albeit not very directly specified in the documents. So let's go to the next slide. So still on the local context, we are saying that there are some vulnerable sectors. Agriculture is leading in terms of vulnerability. We have the water sector. Of course, we're trying to manage scarcity there. Then there's health, especially climate-sensitive diseases like malaria, and also infrastructure that is being impacted negatively. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to the vulnerable communities, we have especially the rural communities that have limited access to resources, the pastoral communities that largely rely on livestock. Then we have women and children that are affected due to their socioeconomic inequalities. We have indigenous groups that depend heavily on natural resources and often are excluded from decision-making processes, and the urban poor, especially in the informal settlements. Let's move to the next slide. So we get to the component of the barriers to equitable adaptation, and we are saying that we have, number one, the resource constraint. If you look at our NDC document, we need about $65 billion US for adaptation and mitigation, at least between 2020 and 2030. Then there is a component of governance, corruption, and lack of transparency. And of course, there are fragmented efforts across government agencies to reduce the effectiveness of adaptation policies. Then we also have a lack of an inclusive and participation process, especially with the marginalized groups, women and youth. That's the component of the recognition justice. There's also the component of data and knowledge gaps, which is insufficient, especially on the climate data and risk assessments that impede effective planning. Next slide, please. Also, we have policy disconnects. We have inconsistencies between national policies and local implementation, short-term planning horizons that overlook long-term resilience building. Then we have socioeconomic inequalities. I think this was mentioned. Of course, we have existing disparities that exacerbate vulnerability. And we have external pressures like dependence of international funding. And in most cases, it doesn't align with the local priorities that we have in the country. Let's move to the next slide. So what are the costs of ignoring equity in the processes? We have examples here, for example, in water resource management. For example, we might have situations where construction of dams and water diversion projects may not have any form of community consultation. And this would reduce water access for downstream communities, for example, affects agricultural productivity and increases conflict. The other one is on agricultural adaptation strategies. So it could be the case that when we are introducing, for example, drought-resistant crops, we may not consider local preferences. And this reduces, for example, food diversity and cultural disconnect. Let's go to the next slide. Also in infrastructure development, when we are building the roads projects, we might prioritize economic growth over community resilience, and this increases vulnerability, especially to floods and landslide. Finally, on health, if you have a lack of equitable access to healthcare services, then this could increase morbidity and mortality among vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. One example is the Lake Turkana wind farm, although this one is a mitigation project, but one thing you realize is that even with the just resilience, these projects have a knock-on effects on adaptation. And the project was aimed at boosting Kenya's renewable energy capacity, and it's a mitigation project, of course, and it displaced about 4,600 indigenous people without adequate consultation or compensation. And the consequences was loss of grazing land, increased poverty, and heightened tensions among communities. So what this means is that if these groups are already disadvantaged, and even if we were to introduce, for example, adaptation projects, they are starting from a point of vulnerability because this has already been introduced to them. So let's go to the next slide. So what are the opportunities for just resilience in Kenya? We are saying that we need an inclusive policy planning process. We need community-led approaches. You engage communities at the outset. Participatory budgeting, you involve marginalized groups, especially in resource allocation. We need also to strengthen local institutions through capacity building, training of local leaders and institutions, decentralized adaptation planning, especially to the local levels. In Kenya, for example, it would be in the county levels. Let's go to the next slide, please. We also need to leverage on indigenous knowledge. The issue of cultural sensitivity, respecting and integrating indigenous practices is very important. And we also have to build knowledge exchange platform, especially facilitating dialogue between scientists and local communities for co-creation of solutions. We also need very innovative financing. For example, climate finance for equity. We dedicate funds specifically for that. Microfinance and insurance, for example, to offer financial solutions to businesses. Nicole, I'm finishing. Then we need monitoring and accountability. We need to have equity audits and also feedback mechanisms to the people. So I think that would be my last slide. Let's go to the next slide, we confirm. Way forward is that we need urgency in just resilience. As I said, we don't have just resilience included in our policy documents. So integration is also key, and we are saying that it's a call to action. Stakeholders must commit to community-driven, culturally informed, and transparently financed adaptation strategies. So looking ahead, we need to have continuous learning and adaptation driven by local insights and global best practices. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. And sorry for my video. I think it had some glitches. So Nicole, back to you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that really comprehensive and interesting presentation. And I think it was very helpful to see some examples of what are the costs of failing to include justice and adaptation and resilience planning. And I'm sure we'll have many questions about that at the end. Just as a reminder, you can drop questions in the Q&A chat throughout, and you can also find links to various reports in the main chat section if you're looking for those. And so with that, we will go to Professor Shamsad Murtuza for his presentation.
Thank you, Nicole. And I will take a slightly different route, I'll focus on with the structural vulnerability and the political capability that Frida mentioned. So the picture that you see is the largest river bridge that we have in Bangladesh, and it's called the Padma Bridge. And this is very iconic of the development that the former government promoted. Can I move to the next slide? And this has been the iconic of the growth that our country experienced. So as we tried to graduate from low-income countries, to the threshold of the least development countries, and so the graduation, was all so on course, as you can see from all the GDP rates, the growth and all that, the 7.8% growth that we were experiencing. But suddenly, we have a setback, with Rohingya migrants coming in from Myanmar, neighboring Myanmar, then global economic shock, pandemic, export decrease, Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I just wanted to find out, how all these, so structural vulnerability actually affected our policy to a great extent. Next slide, please. Now, this is the policy dashboard, where you get to see, all the policies that were in place. And so we we're at par with the global standard, taking the leadership in, climate prosperity as our former government would like to present. And they were, being presented in different forums, international forums, bridging the gap between the local and the global, as well as highlighting the initiatives taken by Bangladesh government in climate diplomacy. But suddenly, so this development narrative came to an halt when we had a regime change last month. So can we move to the next slide? So suddenly, so this idea of having this metro rail, having all these iconic structures, they came to a halt where we have a serious political uprising because there were dissatisfaction, and there's this idea that so the justice that we're talking about, so the justice was not being done, and only an elite group or chosen few were being benefited from the system. So, and I think so this for me is the greatest issue when we talk about equity and equality. Next slide, please. From a climate perspective, so of course we are a climate vulnerable country, right? So we have our environmental challenges, especially because we are nestled between the Himalayan range and the Bay of Bengal. So all the rivers coming from the highlands, so they flow through the deltaic region of Bangladesh. So we are, one of the largest deltas, and we have extreme climate events like cyclones, floods, and these floods are both riverine floods, coastal floods, as well as urban waterlogging. And this climate change poses a severe threat to the country's agricultural productivity with anticipated impacts, including rising temperature, loss of agricultural land, and increasing flooding, right? And also, as a climate vulnerable country, so addressing this risk is essential for resilient economic growth and reducing spatial disparities. And this has, of course, impacted our GDP. The estimate is that, so just because of these climate issues, so it puts an additional 2% additional risk on our national GDP. Next slide, please. So some of the specific areas, if we look at that, we are the 9th most vulnerable country. And as Richard was saying that, so we are at the receiving end of this, carbon emission and all that. So this idea of that we face these climate disasters due to rising sea levels, and we're likely to lose 30% of our agricultural land and 17% of our territory by 2050. And most of our population, so they still rely on agriculture. And there's this loss due to the climate change impact our food security, and so create climate refugees migrating to already overcrowded cities, right? And at the same time, we have heat waves going on, sea level is rising, and already had an impact, especially in the coastal areas where we have salt intrusion, land erosion, and biodiversity loss. Let's move on. Next slide. So what we are looking at, so while preparing this report, so we had a stakeholders meeting, and we tried to understand, the perspectives of different stakeholders. So we wanted to identify the vulnerable groups and the meaning of justice, and especially given the political changeover that we had, so what justice means in this present climate. So we talked about inclusivity, participatory decision-making, and the major impact that we have noticed that, because of the development narrative, so many of the data were inflated, and there is a mismatch between, so the ground reality and the data that was presented before us. And how do you negotiate, and come up with a sustainable solution? So that has been one of the focuses, in our report. And of course, we need to come up with an all-inclusive climate adaptation, success policy. Next slide, please. So the ideas that we presented before the stakeholders, that, what are the different impacts on communities worldwide? So the idea between the local and the global, the disproportionate impact of climate change on Bangladesh's most vulnerable populations. And then we talked about the resource gap and the implementation gap in adaptation policies. Next slide, please. And at the same time, like, who are the people, like, whose voices are not heard, so the missed voices and how local leaders misappropriate resources meant for the needy. And we also talked about lack of accountability and success metrics and some of the ad hoc policies that have been taken, which now need to be revisited and all that, like, the idea that I started my presentation with. Next slide. So just to give you some examples, so I'll focus again just on the flood issues that we are experiencing right now. And so we belong to this flood-prone geographical landscape. And because of higher population density, lack of resources, poverty, like, poor warning system, poor mechanism, and rescue operation, and we don't seem to have any permanent solution to this. And at the same time, we have inadequate protection against future flood risk, related damages, and there are failure of past policies. Next slide. So just to give you an idea, so right now we're experiencing a flood, like, 1/3 of the country is inundated because of heavy monsoon. But this is also due to the fact that there are 54 rivers, coming into our country from our neighboring state, like, particularly India. And so there are a lot of dams and barrages, alongside the border. And we did not have enough warning. So when these floodgates were opened recently. So again, so there's this issue of, like, we have some agreement, we have some international, policies, but those were not respected when these floodgates were opened, and we did not have enough time to respond. And as a result, so millions had to suffer, like, this fatalities. Move on, please. Next. Now, here are some of the examples, like, that we have done, like, some of the previous initiatives. So this is an example of a floating, school. So we previously had floating schools and hospitals. We had flood-resistant housing, on mud plains, and also we had floating agricultural farms. So these are some of the, adaptability that we have noticed. But again, when we went to the stakeholders this time, so we were told that, so the GIS data were not used, and because the river course is moving, the monsoon pattern is changing. So most of the initiatives, like, even the plinth heights and everything, so the dam heights, so they are based on data so that are not current. And as a result, like, so we are not ready for the changing nature of these climate changes. Next slide. So here's an example of the knowledge, exchange path that Richard just mentioned earlier. So right after this flood, what happened? So some private university students, so they came up with this, robot, so to, supply or to access some of the flood victims. But then again, like, so we do not have any, system in place. So that could have promoted this sort of R&D that would have been helpful for the community. So I know Nicole is here. Next slide. So I'm coming to the end. So I'll just move to the last slide. So from our stakeholders meeting, we have noticed that, so we have many cyclone shelters because that's what the donors promoted, but we do not have enough flood shelters. So mainly, like, we have some ad hoc shelters and all that. And also I mentioned the satellite data and all that. So I'll just move to the last slide, I think. So the next slide is the last one. So here is an example of when we have this idea of, like, fish rice integration policy, to address the saline water. But then again, like, so this idea that even though prawn would come up with, like, bigger yields, so farmers are forced to, cultivate shrimp because they do not have enough investment. So you have the knowledge, but then again, like, the adaptation is not, doing justice to our local farmers. I think I will end with that because, okay, I have run out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shamshad. And I think now we're going to move into discussion, but I just wanted to say, I think the approach you've taken is really fascinating in terms of thinking about when we're thinking about just resilience in various contexts, we need to think about the interactions with political vulnerabilities as well, and how they may affect adaptation vulnerabilities, climate vulnerabilities, and how potentially it creates a bit of a circle where those climate vulnerabilities and experiences could also make things harder and create more political instability. So I think you've hit upon a really interesting approach there. And so now as we move into the discussion phase, I think we can take down the slides for now. And what I'll say is just keep dropping questions in the chat. I've seen there's been 1 or 2 discussions happening already, but please feel free to keep those coming. To kick us off, however, I do have a question for Frida, coming back a bit to the roots of just resilience being the just transition framework, which our colleagues here have all worked very closely on as well. Can you tell us a little bit about what the difference is in practice between perhaps applying just transition principles to mitigation policies and mitigation planning, compared to applying a similar approach in terms of just transitions and just resilience to the planning and management of adaptation policies generally?
Thank you, Nicole. I think one of the core differences in the approaches is also what Richard and Shamsad's presentations excellently shown. It's when it comes to justice and adaptation, the sort of the sectors involved, the contextual underpinnings and understandings and interactions are much more diverse. Oftentimes I'm not saying that the just transition for mitigation is a small task, but adaptation happens always locally. Even if there are international dimensions and it might be internationally financed, in the end of the day, adaptation happens locally, and there are so many aspects of the local environment, both practically in the physical environment, but also politically and in the communities that are involved. So I think that's one while we're also struggling with both in policy and kind of research and adaptation actions, sometimes to understand how do we address these, what's the core things to focus on. And as we see, I think again, like Richard's and Shamsad's presentations here on in Kenya, focusing on these sectors, but then in Bangladesh, the general political climate and kind of understanding what are the core aspects of adaptation for also immediate just disaster relief, just shows how diverse these sort of interventions can be.
Thank you so much, Frida. I think that's also an important theoretical context for us to have in our discussion. So we have a really interesting question here in the chat from Glorious Olajire, asking about if there are organizations and communities that are at the forefront of just resilience. And I think it is really interesting to think about what kind of approaches and what kind of decision-making structures can support local communities. And I saw Richard's already begin to answer this question, but I'm also curious from your perspective, Shamshad, if there's any similar approaches with local communities taking a lead in just resilience in Bangladesh, and how perhaps decision makers can support them.
I'd written my response, but it's still possible that I can give some highlights. Now, what I was saying here in Kenya is one of the biggest examples of this intervention is a project that is co-funded by the government and the World Bank. It's called the Financing Locally Led Adaptation, Climate Adaptation. And the way this has been structured, it's structured at the lowest level of governance. And what happens at that level is that the communities themselves, they rank the interventions that they want at their level. And whatever they decide is to be the project, then that is what is funded. So what we would say that is that this has a participatory component. It's not that you come up with a top-down approach where you go and tell communities that we have this, we think that you're facing this problem, and we want to help you adapt to climate change. No, it's flipped, and the communities themselves tell you this is where we feel we have a problem, and they prioritize that, and they tell you to fund that particular intervention. So the community is already involved. There is a lot of ownership, and also the way it's governed. You have representatives also from the communities to make sure that the interventions themselves have the voice of the community. So I could give that example for now, and let maybe Shamsa to continue.
Yeah, so as I was suggesting, like there is a host of policy documents, and almost all the policies, they try to involve the local stakeholders. So that is the most important sector, and especially the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. So this idea of changing vulnerability into prosperity. So that is the key focus, and that has been the focus of the previous government, as I said. But one of the mismatch that we have noticed, during the stakeholders meeting, that the employers and employees, so the workers, so they don't seem to be in sync in terms of their connectivity, because you have the donor insisted policies, so for some institutions you have the Accord Alliance, say for the RMG sectors and all that. But when it comes to implementing them, so there seems to be it's kind of a window dressing, and there are a lot of complaints that we have heard from the actual workers and activists.
Thank you so much, Richard and Shamsad. So I think your answers are really highlighting the importance here of procedural justice, which is also a really important topic in the just transition and mitigation policy planning. And so I have a question for all of you, and maybe we can begin with Frida. But my question is, we see, in the ideal situation, communities are consulted extensively for mitigation policy planning, and as you've just mentioned, ideally for adaptation policy planning as well. But sometimes adaptation happens in a very immediate way to a disaster or a climate shock. It's an immediate reaction. And so I wonder, from your perspectives, how can one sort of implement these just transition and justice or just resilience or justice principles when there might not be that much time for policy planning in adaptation the same way there typically is for mitigation? So perhaps, Frida, you could kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I think it's worth mentioning that, there's an aspect that is super long-term planning sometimes, and sometimes it's super short-term. And I think that often when we talk about these structural inequities and marginalized groups or communities, so the typically when people are less likely to be heard or involved. And I mean, often this comes down to things like just incomes, for example, genders or ethnicity, for example. When it comes to adaptation, because I mean, we are experiencing increased extreme weather events, and sort of in these sectors, there are recurring themes that makes us need to engage with. There are also you can also have sort of an ongoing engagement with the constituencies that are or probably will be relevant for adaptation action also before. And even if you're reacting sort of an emergency capacity, there's still planning also ahead of that. So yeah, I mean, there's, even if it's fast action, and we need fast action in these areas, I think that there's the consideration of special groups or thinking about structural inequities in these settings are really important. I mean, that said, I think it's important, like we talk about these three core principles of justice and adaptation. The idea is not to make it harder to do adaptation, right? But if we get used to having these core principles in the back of our heads as we're doing adaptation, just the risk of maladaptive outcomes, for example, or really unintended or skewed effects just becomes way less. It is really a problem for adaptation action in general that we are missing the target a lot. So I think that's a really important argument for why it's not just more work, it's actually about being effective and doing adaptation in the way that it actually helps in a way.
Thank you so much, Frida. That was a really interesting response and helpful for us to further our thinking on this question. I don't know if Richard and Shamshed, if either of you have a response.
Well, sometimes I think it's quite hard to plan, especially for emergency response. Things just happen, and then, of course, the government has to do something, sometimes to save lives, and you may not have planning sessions, especially for emergency responses. So that has to be done. But we could already, I believe that if you map a country, you already know potential areas of risks in each particular locality. So it's important perhaps to involve, I think Frida said this, we need to have some more long-term planning for the ones that we can't deal with a lot of planning. Those ones we just have to have emergency response. But if we can have some long-term planning and know that, for example, if it's droughts and maybe planting drought-tolerant crops, that is something already that can be planned. We know that these particular areas are prone to droughts, and maybe we can plan for that. In instances, for example, where we have livestock, we can have insurance, forward planning for maybe insurance that could be given to farmers in case they fall into these emergencies. So it's a mixture, it's a mixed basket. You can't say whether for sure you're going to plan for everything, but long-term planning can help to curb some of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah.
Right. So I think, like, one of the, again, lessons that we learned, like, with this political changeover, that you can plan a lot of things, but then again, so you're never ready. And especially the concept of, like, just transition, when you say, like, nobody is left behind. So when we say, like, nobody, like, how do you include everyone? Because there's so many varieties, so many different agendas, so many different priorities. So in terms of policy, that becomes an issue. Like, when you talk about an overarching inclusivity, and that becomes a serious issue because the priorities are never the same. The, objectives are never the same, So that has become a serious challenge for us, like, to bring everyone on the same plane.
Thank you all for your comments on that. And I think it's really interesting for us to think, or helpful for us to think about how we're responding on different timescales. So unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So I just wanted to pose one final question to each of you. And perhaps, you can think in one sentence, what would be the main sort of takeaway that you would want people to leave with today, particularly thinking about in practice, how can we support decision makers in integrating these just resilience principles in either these sort of like longer term resilience policies or more immediate term policies? Is there anyone who has like an immediate reaction to this?
Maybe I can just go first, like, so what we notice that, there is a certain skepticism about, like, knowledge coming from global north. And so this idea that, so we need to have our own indigenous formula to deal with our own problems, because the policymakers, and they're also skeptic about new terms and new coinage, because they think that, we're already doing this. Why do we need new terms? So there is resistance to that kind of, like, knowledge transfer.
Yeah, I think the terminology that we're using here in terms of distributive recognition and the other terminology maybe seems new terminology, but these are things I think people have been interacting with for a long time. It's just that they've been given some more definition from a perspective of just resilience. The terminology of just resilience is fairly new. And so it's just transition, actually. So for many of the policymakers in our countries, what we need is that they need to be exposed to these terminologies and what they mean. Some might be practicing them as it is, but without explicitly defining them in this way. Some of the interventions that we are having, adaptation interventions, might be having components of this. It's just that we have to concretize these ones and make sure that the projects that we're using, the adaptation projects, have a structured way of intervention. It's not that these components are not there. Some of them could be there, but we may need to structure it and maybe expose policymakers more in this general direction. Thank you.
And I think maybe going forward, especially for the development of the kind of justice resilience agenda in general, and these aspects of global north, global south, and the most vulnerable, I find it really interesting, this aspect of like, how do we navigate these complex and unjust realities as they are, the structural components that goes into that are really not really about adaptation itself, but interact so much with the actions that we do that they might be sometimes it'll be, adaptation might be about breaking down or interfering with these structural injustices, but sometimes sort of the realities will be that we have to coexist with injustices or structural injustices, or corruption, for example, or political injustices, as they are, to be able to do adaptation. And I find this, especially, it's potent all around the world, but there's especially a difference in how you approach policy, I think, from a European perspective, for example, or in a developing country scenario, for example, where realities really plays a role in both of those settings, but in different ways, I think. And just navigating those complex structural realities, I think, is going to be interesting forward to see how these different kind of policies and intervention tactics sort of pan out. Yeah.
Thank you all for those very thoughtful reflections. And I think it sounds like there's a lot of work to do in terms of teasing out the complexity, in terms of linking it to existing policies and priorities in different countries. And I think this also ties well to a comment we received from one of our members at Climate Strategies, Suruchi Badwal, who has mentioned that, we need to consider, in addition to these reactive components, that adaptation is planned across the entire DRR agenda and climate action. And I want to say thank you to our excellent researchers, all our attendees today, and also to our supporters at the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group and European for their support. And thank you also to my colleague Fanny, who did an outstanding job organizing this webinar, and many others. Thanks again, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful day.